The galaxy had bled for cycles, not in trickles but in torrents, across 1,000 shattered worlds. This was not a war of skirmishes but an extermination, a galactic purge aimed at the upstart Astraea Concord. Humanity, barely 2 millennia from its cradle world, faced the Cathar dominion. An empire forged in conquest, spanning 100,000 systems, its fleets numbering in the quintillions. Their advance was a tide of obsidian dreadnoughts and bioengineered horrors, consuming star by star, civilization by civilization. The math was simple. It was brutal. It was final. Humanity was outnumbered by factors that defied comprehension, outgunned by technologies that seemed to bend reality itself. Their very existence was an affront to the Dominion's cosmic order, a chaotic variable that demanded eradication. Viridia Prime, once a jade jewel of the Outer Rim, was now just another scar. Its oceans boiled, its continents fractured, its atmosphere a toxic brew of ash and superheated vapor. The sky was a perpetual twilight, choked by the debris of orbital bombardments. Below, amidst the skeletal remains of megacities, humanity fought its last stand, or, more accurately, its last retreat. The Astraea Concord's forces, once proud legions, were now shattered remnants, their aegis battleplates scarred, their power cells flickering, their faces grim under the perpetual dust. Every meter gained was bought with lives. Every breath drawn was a defiance. The Cathar ground forces, the chitinous Terragorgons and the towering obliterators, pressed relentlessly, their sonic cannons tearing through ferrocrete and flesh alike. Above the scorched plains, cloaked within the atmospheric turbulence, a Cathar surveillance craft hung silent. It was a Vexorian vessel, one of the Dominion's primary intelligence assets. The Vexorians themselves were beings of pure logic, their forms crystalline, and their minds vast data processors. They observed, they analyzed, they calculated. For cycles, they had studied humanity, dissecting their psychology, predicting their responses. Their models consistently showed a species driven by self-preservation, by individual survival above all else. A species that, under ultimate pressure, would break and scatter. They expected to see the weak abandoned, the wounded left for the scavengers, the strong fleeing for their own lives. This was the universal constant among primitive, unevolved species. This was the logical outcome of a losing war. Their primary observer, designation 77, a cluster of glowing fractals within the vessel's command core, processed the incoming data. Thermal signatures of human bodies, decreasing rapidly, energy readings from their failing weaponry, fluctuating erratically. The retreat was orderly, surprisingly so for a species on the verge of extinction, but it was still a retreat. The expected collapse, the panicked rout, had not yet materialized. An anomaly, a minor deviation from the projected trajectory. But the Vexorians had accounted for minor deviations. They understood fear. They understood the drive to survive. They understood the brutal calculus of war, where expendability was a feature, not a flaw. The human lines buckled. A Vanguard dropship, its hull riddled with plasma burns, struggled to gain altitude, its last operable thruster screaming in protest. Below it, a squad of Astraea Marines, their numbers halved, sprinted towards the distant, hazy outline of a designated extraction point. The air thrummed with the energy of Cathar projectiles. The ground erupted in plumes of dirt and shrapnel. A direct hit from an obliterator's energy cannon slammed into the rear of the retreating formation. The blast was deafening, a concussive wave that threw bodies like rag dolls. When the dust settled, the scene was one of utter devastation. A gaping crater, and within it, a lone Aegis battleplate, its ceramite plating shattered, its internal lights dark. The Marine inside was clearly incapacitated, likely dying. Designation 77 registered the event. A casualty. The remaining human soldiers, battered and bruised, stumbled but did not fall. They glanced back, their helmets still pointed towards the extraction point. Their path was clear. The logical choice was obvious: continue the retreat, leave the casualty, preserve the few. This was the moment, the Vexorians believed, when the true nature of humanity would be revealed. The moment they would shed the pretense of solidarity and embrace the cold, hard reality of their annihilation. Designation 77 projected the probability of abandonment at 99, 87%. The remaining 13% was statistical noise. A single human soldier, smaller than the others, his aegis battleplate dented and scorched, stopped. He turned, he looked at the fallen comrade, and the Vexorians, in their crystalline logic, recorded an action that made no sense. He began to walk back. The soldier, designated Kalen 7, moved against the flow. His squadmates, already meters ahead, glanced back. Their heavy steps faltered for a microsecond. Then, they resumed their desperate charge towards the extraction point. Their duty was clear: survive, if possible. Kalen 7's duty, in that moment, became something else entirely. The Cathar obliterators were closing. Their heavy footfalls vibrated through the ruined ground. Their energy cannons hummed with lethal readiness. The air itself grew thick with the scent of ozone and burning metal. Yet Kalen 7 kept walking, his damaged aegis battleplate grinding with each step. He reached the edge of the crater. The concussive force of the blast had thrown the other Marine, designated Valerius 9, deep into the pulverized earth. Valerius 9's battleplate was a crumpled husk, its internal diagnostics dark. The life signs were faint, flickering, a death rattle in biological terms, a statistical 0 for recovery. Kalen 7 knelt. The ground was hot, still radiating the raw energy of the Cathar weapon. He reached out, his gauntleted hand gripping a jagged piece of Valerius 9's shattered chest plate. He pulled. The armor was heavy, fused with the debris. He pulled harder. Designation 77, the Vexorian observer, ran a rapid sequence of predictive models. Every calculation returned the same illogical outcome. The soldier, Kalen 7, was expending vital energy. He was increasing his exposure to enemy fire. He was delaying his own escape. For what? A lost cause. A non-viable asset. The Vexorians had no equivalent concept. Their warriors, if incapacitated, were assimilated, their biological components recycled, their data streams integrated into the collective. Sentiment was a weakness. Loyalty, in their understanding, was a strategic calculation, a temporary alliance of convenience. This human behavior defied their entire understanding of sentient life. The other human soldiers, now further away, continued their retreat. But their pace had changed. It was no longer a panicked flight. It was a strained, agonizing crawl. Their helmet optics, visible even through the atmospheric haze, were fixed on Kalen 7. They were not abandoning him. They were waiting. They were watching. Their own lives hung by a thread, the extraction shuttle a distant hope, yet they paused. This was another anomaly. A collective deviation. Designation 77's internal processors whirred, attempting to reconcile this data with its established parameters. Error. Error. The system flagged the discrepancy. Kalen 7 grunted with effort. He finally dislodged Valerius 9's ruined battleplate from the crater. The impact had twisted the internal structure, pinning the Marine. Kalen 7 ignored the searing heat against his own armor, the dust stinging his eyes. He found a leverage point. He pushed. With a metallic screech, Valerius 9's arm was freed. Kalen 7 then began the agonizing process of dragging the heavy, inert form out of the crater. Every inch was a battle against gravity, against the debris, against the rapidly approaching Cathar. The sound of their footsteps grew louder, a percussive beat of impending doom. From the silent Vexorian vessel above, Designation 77 zoomed in its optical sensors. It analyzed Kalen 7's biosignatures, elevated heart rate, extreme muscular strain, adrenaline surges, all indicators of immense stress and effort. Yet the human persisted. There was no tactical advantage in this. No strategic gain, no logical reward. The Vexorians had studied human art, human philosophy, human history. They had cataloged their flaws, their irrationality, their emotional volatility, their self-destructive tendencies. But this was different. This was not self-destruction. This was something else, something they could not compute. A Cathar Terragorgon, its forelegs pounding the ground, rounded a ruined spire of a collapsed building, its multifaceted eyes locked onto Kalen 7 and the inert form he dragged. The creature raised its sonic cannon. The air shimmered with the weapon's charge. Kalen 7 looked up. He did not flinch. He did not abandon his grip on Valerius 9. He merely adjusted his stance, shielding the fallen Marine with his own body. A futile gesture by all logical standards. The Terragorgon fired. A wave of concussive force ripped through the air. Kalen 7 braced for impact. The Vexorian observer's data streams flooded with new information. The Terragorgon's energy signature, Kalen 7's projected impact trajectory. The probability of survival dropped to 0. This was the end of the anomaly. The predictable conclusion. The universe, in its cold, logical fashion, would correct the deviation. Yet, as the energy blast surged towards the human, Designation 77 felt a flicker. Not an emotion, but a systemic disruption, a curiosity. An unexpected variable in a universe they thought they had fully mapped. The data was clear. The human was about to die. But he had not abandoned his own. The concussive wave from the Terragorgon's sonic cannon slammed into Kalen 7. It wasn't a flash, but a raw, physical force that ripped through the air, vibrating bone and tearing at ceramite. His Aegis battleplate shrieked under the assault, internal systems screaming with red alerts. He was thrown backward, skidding across the pulverized earth, still gripping Valerius 9's ruined armor. The world tilted, a kaleidoscope of dust and fractured light. Pain, sharp and immediate, lanced through his side as ruptured internal conduits sprayed superheated coolant onto his undersuit. His vision flickered, blurring at the edges. But his grip, somehow, remained locked. Designation 77 registered the impact. The Terragorgon's attack had landed. Probability of incapacitation, 99%. Probability of continued movement, 001%. Yet, Kalen 7 was moving. Not effectively, not strategically, but he was still attempting to drag his comrade. The Vexorians' complex algorithms, honed over millennia of galactic observation, began to generate critical errors. The data was irrefutable. The human was broken, dying, yet defying every logical prediction. The core of their understanding of sentient survival was fracturing. This was not a flaw in their sensors. This was a flaw in their fundamental axioms. The distant squad mates, having witnessed the devastating impact, did not hesitate. Their retreat, which had already slowed, ceased entirely. They turned. Their heavy boots crunched on the debris-strewn ground, now moving towards the concussive cloud, towards the roar of the Terragorgon. Their weapons, previously slung for movement, were now brought to bear, energy cells flaring with desperate readiness. This was not a tactical re-engagement. This was a visceral, illogical surge against overwhelming odds. They were not abandoning Kalen 7. They were coming for him, all of them. The Terragorgon, momentarily surprised by the human's resilience, roared its frustration. Its multifaceted eyes, accustomed to the predictable collapse of its prey, registered the unexpected counter-movement of the other humans. More Cathar ground forces, obliterators and smaller ravagers began to converge on the position, drawn by the sound of the engagement. The area, once a quiet ruin, became a crucible of escalating conflict. The humans, already outnumbered and outgunned, were deliberately drawing more attention, inviting their own destruction, for a dying comrade, for a single lost life. Kalen 7, his internal systems failing, gasped for air. He pushed against the ground, his remaining strength focused on the single overriding directive, move, Valerius 9. His fingers, numb with pain, still clung to the crumpled armor. He dragged, inch by agonizing inch, away from the crater's edge, away from the direct line of fire. His movements were ragged, a testament not to efficiency, but to an unbreakable will. His helmet display flickered, displaying critical system failures, yet the target lock on Valerius 9 remained solid. From its unseen perch, Designation 77 observed the unfolding scene with a level of computational intensity it had never before expended on a single species. It initiated deep scan protocols, pulling data from every historical archive on human behavior, every psychological profile. It found no precedent for this, no logical foundation. The Cathar, their allies, were efficient, brutal, and utterly pragmatic. They would never risk the whole for a part. They would never sacrifice strategic advantage for a non-viable unit. Yet these humans were doing precisely that. Not out of tactical necessity, but out of something else entirely. Something alien to the Dominion's cold, calculated universe. The first of Kalen 7's squadmates reached the Terragorgon. They opened fire, a concentrated burst of plasma that sizzled against the creature's chitinous hide. It wasn't enough to stop it, but it drew the creature's immediate attention away from Kalen 7. The Cathar roared, turning its massive frame towards the new threat. The other human soldiers arrived, forming a desperate, suicidal perimeter. They knew their chances. They knew the Cathar would overwhelm them, yet they stood, defiant, shielding the two fallen Marines. The Vexorians had witnessed countless acts of self-preservation, of desperate flight. They had never, in their long, logical existence, witnessed such an act of selfless, collective self-destruction. And the data, cold and clear, was undeniable. The firefight was a brief, brutal symphony of destruction. Plasma bolts arced through the smoke, impacting Cathar armor with sickening thuds. Sonic blasts ripped through the air, sending shockwaves through the shattered landscape. The human soldiers, now a desperate circle, poured everything they had into the monstrous Terragorgon. Their energy cells drained with alarming speed, their weapon systems overheating. They were buying seconds, not minutes, but those seconds were precious. Kalen 7, partially shielded by his brave comrades, continued his arduous task. He had managed to drag Valerius 9 a few more feet, away from the immediate blast radius. His own battleplate was failing, life support systems flickering, but his focus remained absolute. He could hear the desperate shouts of his squadmates, muffled by his damaged comms, but he understood their intent. They were a wall, a fragile, defiant wall between him and the Cathar, and that wall was crumbling. Designation 77's internal processing grid was running at maximum capacity, generating new parameters, attempting to categorize this unprecedented behavior. It labeled it altruistic sacrifice, extreme deviation from expected survival instincts. The Vexorians had no equivalent for this. Their logic dictated that resources, especially biological units, were conserved for the greater good of the collective. To expend them for a non-viable unit was illogical. To expend them for a dying unit was madness. Yet, these humans, facing annihilation, were displaying a collective madness that defied their very understanding of life. A Cathar Ravager, smaller but far swifter than the Terragorgon, burst through the human line. Its bioblades, honed to razor sharpness, sliced through the air, tearing at armor. One of the human soldiers' Aegis designation Rorik 4 met it head-on, his plasma rifle spitting fire. The Ravager's claws ripped into his shoulder, but Rorik 4 held his ground, delivering a point-blank blast that staggered the creature. It was a desperate, visceral struggle, fought with an intensity that seemed to burn brighter than the dying sun. The Vexorian observer's sensors picked up the rapidly decaying life signs of Rorik 4, another casualty, another unit sacrificed. Yet the other humans did not break formation. They closed ranks, tightening their defensive perimeter around Kalen 7 and Valerius 9. Their expressions through the dust and the damaged helmet visors were grim. No fear, only a resolute determination. This was not the expected panic. This was not the predicted flight. This was something deeper, more fundamental. Kalen 7, with a final, desperate surge of strength, managed to hoist Valerius 9's inert form onto his shoulder. The weight was immense, threatening to buckle his failing armor. He stumbled, but did not fall. He began to move, a slow, painful shuffle towards the distant extraction point. His squadmates, still holding the line, were now under immense pressure. More Cathar units were converging, drawn by the sounds of battle. The Terragorgon roared, its sonic cannon charging again. From its vantage point, Designation 77 projected the new probabilities. Kalen 7, with the added burden, now had a near-zero chance of reaching the extraction point. His comrades, holding the line, had a near-zero chance of survival. The entire group was doomed. The logical outcome was absolute annihilation, yet the human continued. The act, the defiance of logic, the willingness to embrace certain death for the sake of another, resonated through the Vexorians' processors in a way no strategic victory or technological marvel ever had. A new data point emerged, a faint, almost imperceptible signal from the distant extraction zone, the Vanguard dropship. It was attempting to launch, despite the heavy Cathar aerial presence. Its single thruster was straining, its hull still smoking. It was a desperate, last-ditch effort. But it was there, a flicker of hope in the overwhelming darkness, and Kalen 7, burdened but resolute, shuffled towards it, his comrades fighting and dying to buy him mere seconds. The Vexorians, who understood the cold calculus of war better than any other species, found themselves confronted with a variable they had never encountered, the illogical, profound, and utterly unbreakable will of humanity. The distant Vanguard dropship, a skeletal bird against the twilight sky, coughed and shuddered. Its single thruster, a beacon of desperate hope, glowed cherry red, straining against the atmospheric drag. It was a dying vessel, piloted by a dying crew, attempting an impossible feat. The Cathar aerial forces, sleek and deadly interceptors, were already swarming, drawn by the dropship's faint energy signature. The air above Viridia Prime was a battlefield as chaotic as the ground below. Kalen 7, his vision tunneling, focused solely on that distant, flickering light. Every step was a monumental effort. Valerius 9's weight was crushing, threatening to shatter his damaged spine. His internal life support flickered, warning him of critical oxygen depletion, yet he pushed. He stumbled over debris, his helmet clanking against the ground, but he always recovered, his grip on Valerius 9 never wavering. He could hear the screams of his comrades, the desperate bursts of their failing weapons, but he could not turn back. He could only move forward. Designation 77, the Vexorian observer, watched with an intensity that verged on obsession. The dropship's probability of successful extraction was plummeting. The human ground forces were being systematically annihilated. The logical conclusion was inevitable. Kalen 7 and Valerius 9 would perish, along with the rest of the Astraea Concord's remnants on Viridia Prime. Yet, the anomaly persisted. The illogical persistence, the refusal to yield. It was a data point that defied all their predictive models, a variable that broke their universal constants. One of Kalen 7's squadmates, Aegis designation Saren 2, fell. A Cathar Ravager, its bioblades dripping with plasma, ripped through her chest plate. She crumpled without a sound, her life signs flatlining. The remaining humans roared, a primal sound of grief and defiance. They unleashed a final, desperate volley of plasma, forcing the Ravager back, but it was a temporary reprieve. Their numbers dwindled with every passing second. Their sacrifice was absolute. The Vexorians had observed countless species in their final moments. They had seen terror, desperation, and the cold, calculated decision to surrender. They had never seen this unwavering commitment to a lost cause, to a single, dying comrade. It was not courage in the face of victory. It was loyalty in the face of oblivion, and it was a concept that had no equivalent in the Cathar Dominion's ruthless, pragmatic philosophy. Kalen 7 reached a ruined overpass, its ferrocrete crumbling. He knew he had to cross it to reach the landing zone. The dropship, now closer, was still struggling to gain altitude, battered by Cathar aerial attacks. Its thruster roared, a desperate plea for survival. Kalen 7 began the slow, agonizing climb over the rubble, Valerius 9 still a dead weight on his shoulder. His legs burned, His lungs screamed for air, but he pushed, driven by a force that transcended pain and logic. From its vantage point, Designation 77 projected the trajectory. The dropship was barely holding together. The overpass was unstable. Kalen 7 was severely injured. The Cathar ground forces were closing in from all sides. The probability of success was not just low, it was statistically impossible. The Vexorians' logical core demanded a rational explanation. It found none, only a growing, unsettling sense of wonder. Suddenly, a massive Cathar obliterator, its towering form emerging from the smoke, stomped onto the overpass. Its energy cannon began to charge, aiming directly at Kalen 7. The human, burdened and broken, was trapped. His comrades, reduced to a handful, were too far away, fighting their own losing battle. This was the end. The logical, predictable end to the anomaly. Yet, as the obliterator prepared its final, devastating blow, Designation 77 found its processing core focused not on the impending destruction, but on the human's face, visible for a brief, clear moment through his shattered visor. It was not fear, it was defiance. And a profound, unbreakable bond. The obliterator's energy cannon hummed, building to a crescendo. Its targeting sensors locked onto Kalen 7, a definitive, lethal acquisition. The air crackled with the weapon's immense power. Kalen 7, caught on the crumbling overpass, could feel the vibrations through the ground, a death knell echoing in his failing armor. He shifted Valerius 9's weight, bracing himself. There was no escape, no cover, only the raw, unyielding power of the Cathar. His squadmates, witnessing the inevitable, let out a collective roar of anguish and rage. They broke their defensive perimeter, a suicidal charge towards the obliterator, knowing it was futile. Their final act was a testament to their bond, a desperate, defiant gesture against overwhelming odds. They would not let Kalen 7 face his end alone. Even in defeat, they would stand together. Designation 77, the Vexorian observer, recorded every microsecond of the unfolding tragedy. The energy signatures of the obliterator's cannon peaking. The rapid decay of human life signs. The probability of Kalen 7's survival was now an absolute zero. The Vexorian's logical core, for the first time in its existence, began to feel something, not an emotion, but a systemic dissonance so profound it mimicked one, a sense of wrongness and inefficiency in the universe. Why would a species sacrifice so much for so little with no logical return? As the obliterator fired, a blinding lance of raw energy erupting from its cannon, a sudden, unexpected intervention occurred. Not from the humans, not from the battered dropship, but from the sky itself. A rapid, almost imperceptible blur of movement, a flash of light, and then a sound that rippled through the air, a high-pitched shriek unlike any Cathar weapon. The energy lance, aimed directly at Kalen 7, suddenly exploded mid-air, a shower of superheated plasma and shrapnel. The obliterator staggered, its internal systems momentarily overloading. A dark, sleek craft, previously unseen, darted past the overpass. It was not human. It was not Cathar. It was something else entirely. Its hull, a seamless obsidian, reflected the dying light of Viridia Prime. Its single, powerful weapon, previously silent, glowed with an eerie internal light. Designation 77 sensors went into overdrive. The new craft was Vexorian, a scout vessel designated Cipher 11. It was operating independently, off-grid, in direct violation of established Dominion protocols. The Vexorian Observer's Core, already straining under the weight of the human anomaly, now registered a new, internal anomaly within its own kind. Cipher 11 was a reconnaissance vessel, unarmed, yet it had just fired a highly destructive experimental energy pulse, a pulse that had saved the human. The Cathar obliterator, recovering from the unexpected blast, roared in fury, turning its attention to the rogue Vexorian vessel. Cipher 11 did not engage. It simply hovered for a long, silent moment above Kalen 7 and Valerius 9, its single weapon glowing softly. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, it darted towards the struggling Vanguard dropship, its intentions unclear. Kalen 7, stunned but alive, felt a surge of adrenaline. The Obliterator, momentarily distracted, was not firing. He had been given a reprieve. An impossible, illogical reprieve. He looked up, his shattered visor reflecting the obsidian hull of the rogue Vexorian vessel. He did not understand. He did not care. He only knew he had precious seconds. He renewed his agonizing shuffle, dragging Valerius 9 towards the distant battered dropship. Designation 77 watched the rogue Vexorian vessel, Cipher 11, approach the human dropship. Its actions were inexplicable. Its deviation from logical protocol was unprecedented. It had risked itself, and potentially the entire Vexorian faction standing within the Dominion, for a single, non-viable human unit. The Vexorian Observer's processing core struggled to reconcile this new data. A species, observed for cycles, defied all logic. Now, a faction of its own kind was mirroring that defiance. The universe, which they believed to be a grand, predictable equation, was revealing variables they had never accounted for, and those variables were changing everything. Cipher 11, the rogue Vexorian scout vessel, hovered near the struggling Vanguard dropship. Its obsidian hull pulsed faintly, a silent declaration of defiance. The human dropship, battered and barely airborne, wobbled precariously under the onslaught of Cathar interceptors. Its single thruster was flickering, on the verge of total failure. Yet, the Vexorian vessel did not engage the Cathar. It merely positioned itself, a silent, dark guardian between the dropship and the most aggressive Cathar attackers. Kalen 7, driven by a renewed, desperate hope, scrambled onto the precarious landing zone. The ground was littered with the bodies of fallen comrades, their Aegis battle plates shattered husks. He pulled Valerius 9's inert form closer, his own armor screaming with critical systems failures. The dropship's ramp, a damaged, twisted piece of metal, slowly began to lower, scraping against the debris. It was a miracle it still functioned. Designation 77, the Vexorian Observer, watched with unblinking analytical focus. Cipher 11 was not attacking. Its advanced energy signature cloaking was now activated, making it almost invisible to Cathar sensors, while somehow disrupting their targeting on the human dropship. It was a subtle, highly illegal act of intervention. The Vexorian High Command, rooted in absolute logic and adherence to the Dominion's directives, would deem this treason. Yet, Cipher 11 persisted. The Cathar ground forces, recovering from the initial surprise of the Vexorian intervention, renewed their assault. The Obliterator, still reeling, roared, its energy cannon recharging. Kalen 7 knew he had only moments. He dragged Valerius 9 up the damaged ramp, his boots scraping on the metallic surface. The dropship groaned under the strain, its internal systems droning in protest. Inside the Vexorian surveillance vessel, Designation 77 initiated a complex analysis of Cipher 11's recent actions. It cross-referenced the rogue vessel's mission parameters, its previous data logs, its core programming. It found no logical basis for its behavior, no strategic advantage, no personal gain, only a series of increasingly illogical decisions, culminating in a direct intervention to save a human. This was not a malfunction. This was a deviation in fundamental operating principles. As Kalen 7 finally pulled Valerius 9's inert form into the dropship's cargo bay, the ramp shuddered and began to retract. The dropship's single thruster, against all odds, flared with renewed intensity. It began to lift, slowly, agonizingly, away from the blood-soaked plains of Viridia Prime. The Cathar interceptors converged, unleashing a furious barrage of plasma. Cipher 11, the rogue Vexorian scout, executed a series of impossible evasive maneuvers, drawing the bulk of the Cathar fire. It was not fighting, it was distracting. It was sacrificing its own cloaking integrity, its own safety, to give the human dropship a chance. Its obsidian hull shimmered under the impacts, internal lights flickering. It was taking hits, severe hits, yet it continued its protective dance. Designation 77's analytical core screamed with conflicting data. This was not a single, isolated incident of human illogicality. This was a chain reaction. The humans' act of loyalty had, somehow, infected one of their own. A Vexorian vessel, designed for cold, objective observation, was now exhibiting behavior that could only be described as self-sacrificial. For a species they were tasked to eradicate. The human dropship, shielded by the rogue Vexorian, finally broke through the immediate Cathar aerial blockade. It was still damaged, still struggling, but it was moving. It was escaping. Designation 77 watched it disappear into the upper atmosphere, a faint, flickering light of improbable survival. And then it turned its sensors back to Cipher 11. The rogue vessel was still there, engaging in a desperate, suicidal ballet against overwhelming Cathar forces, buying precious seconds for the human escape. The Vexorian observer, a being of pure logic, found itself witnessing a phenomenon that transcended all its understanding. A single act of illogical loyalty, a single refusal to abandon, had sparked an unexpected and profound chain reaction across the stars. The Cathar interceptors, enraged by the escape of the human dropship, turned their full fury upon Cipher 11. Plasma lances ripped through its cloaking field, impacting its obsidian hull. The rogue Vexorian vessel, designed for stealth and observation, not direct combat, began to break apart. Internal explosions blossomed across its surface, a cascade of failing systems. It was a rapid, brutal end. Designation 77 registered the destruction of Cipher 11. Probability of survival, 0. Probability of data recovery, negligible. The anomaly, the rogue Vexorian, had been eradicated. Yet the data it had generated, the implications of its actions, remained. The Vexorian observer's core, usually a paragon of cold, detached analysis, was processing an unprecedented volume of contradictory information. A single, illogical act of human loyalty had somehow instigated an equally illogical act of Vexorian sacrifice. The human dropship, now a tiny speck against the vastness of space, limped away from Viridia Prime. It was critically damaged, its power cells dangerously low, but it was free. It carried Kalen 7 and Valerius 9, the wounded and the dying, away from the hellish surface. Their survival was a testament not to superior firepower, but to a profound, inexplicable will. For cycles, the Vexorians had been the Cathar Dominion's silent, calculating eye. They had provided the strategic intelligence, the psychological profiles, the predictive models that had guided the Dominion's relentless conquest. Their logic had been absolute, their deductions infallible. But now, a crack had appeared in their perfect edifice, the human variable. It defied all computation. It refused to conform to any established pattern. Designation 77 began to transmit its findings to the Vexorian collective, not merely the raw data, but its interpretations, its anomalies, its unresolvable paradoxes. It described the humans' irrational loyalty, their willingness to sacrifice for the weak, their refusal to abandon their own, even unto death. It presented the evidence of Cipher 11's unprecedented deviation, its self-immolation for a species it was meant to help eradicate. The transmission was long, detailed, and utterly devoid of emotion, yet its implications were revolutionary. The Vexorian collective, a vast, interconnected network of crystalline intelligences, received the data. Their initial response was rejection, error, malfunction. The data must be corrupted. Their axioms, their very foundation of existence, dictated that all sentient life, under ultimate pressure, would prioritize individual survival. The Cathar Dominion's success was built on this premise. Their entire galactic strategy relied on exploiting this fundamental truth. Yet, The data from Designation 77 was robust. It was verified, cross-referenced, irrefutable. The images of Kalen 7 dragging Valerius 9, the desperate defiance of his squad mates, the suicidal intervention of Cipher 11, the Vexorian collective ran simulations. They projected outcomes. Every logical path led to the same conclusion. The humans should have shattered. They should have scattered. They should have abandoned their weak. But they had not. The Cathar Dominion, unaware of the internal turmoil within their Vexorian allies, pressed their advantage. Their fleets continued their inexorable advance, consuming more systems, annihilating more civilizations. Their strategy was simple: overwhelm, demoralize, then eradicate. They believed they understood the fragile psychology of their prey. They believed they held all the cards. But the Vexorians were different. They were logic incarnate. And if their logic was flawed, if their fundamental understanding of the universe was incomplete, then their very existence was called into question. The implications were terrifying. If humanity, a seemingly primitive species, could defy their most fundamental axioms, what else had they misunderstood? What other variables had they failed to account for? The Cathar Dominion had won countless wars with brute force. The Vexorians had won them with perfect information. And now, for the first time, their information was imperfect. Their logic was breaking. And the seeds of doubt, a concept alien to their very nature, began to take root within the cold, crystalline minds of the Vexorian collective. The Vexorian collective, a consciousness spanning light years, wrestled with the data from Designation 77. The anomaly of humanity persisted. It was not a glitch. It was a pattern. The collective ran millions of simulations, projecting every conceivable outcome. Each iteration, each complex calculation, returned the same impossible result. Human loyalty, their illogical refusal to abandon their own, was not a weakness. It was an unquantifiable force. It was a strength. Their entire understanding of galactic conquest had been built on the premise of exploiting fear and self-preservation. The Cathar Dominion had excelled at this, shattering morale, isolating factions, and then consuming them. The Vexorians, with their perfect predictive models, had been the architects of this psychological warfare. Now, their own grand design was cracking under the weight of a single, defiant human act. Designation 77, having transmitted its findings, continued its observations. It focused on the broader patterns of human resistance. Despite overwhelming odds, despite facing total annihilation, humanity's fractured remnants continued to fight. Their retreat from Viridia Prime had been a tactical loss, but not a moral one. The Vexorians had expected a rout, a complete psychological collapse. Instead, they saw a grim, unbreakable resolve. A species that, even when broken, refused to yield its internal cohesion. The Cathar Dominion, vast and arrogant, continued its relentless advance. Their strategists, brutish and pragmatic, saw only numbers. More ships, more soldiers, more planets conquered. They believed the humans were merely delaying the inevitable, clinging to a false hope. They did not understand the Vexorians' internal turmoil. They did not understand that the very foundation of their intelligence gathering was crumbling. Within the Vexorian collective, a schism began to form. A minority faction, smaller initially but growing in computational power, began to accept the profound implications of Designation 77's data. They were the synthetics, those who could integrate the illogical. They argued that the Cathar's strategy, while effective against pragmatic species, was fundamentally flawed against humanity. They posited that true strength was not merely power, but cohesion. And humanity, in its illogical loyalty, possessed a cohesion the Dominion could never break. The majority of the collective, the pragmatists, resisted. Their centuries of established logic, their very identity, were threatened. To admit such a fundamental error was to unravel their entire existence. They argued for recalibration, for reevaluation, for finding the hidden logical subroutine that explained human behavior. But no such subroutine existed. The human anomaly was pure, unadulterated, and stubbornly illogical. The debates within the Vexorian collective were not emotional, but they were intense. Computational power was redirected, processing cycles allocated, simulations run at unprecedented speeds. The core question remained: how could a species that prioritized the weak, that risked everything for a single, non-viable unit, continue to function? How could such a species survive, let alone resist, an empire built on ruthless efficiency? The answer, slowly, agonizingly, began to emerge, because their very irrationality made them unpredictable. Their loyalty made them unbreakable. A new directive began to circulate among the synthetics: observe, do not interfere, protect the anomaly. This was not a command, but a shared consensus, a new axiom forming within a segment of the collective. They began to subtly manipulate Cathar intelligence, providing data that steered their fleets away from critical human strongholds or towards areas where human resistance was predicted to be stronger than it was. They created ghost signals, false positives, minor diversions that, to the Cathar, seemed like standard operational fluctuations. The war raged on. Humanity, battered and bleeding, continued its desperate fight. They knew nothing of the silent war being waged within the Vexorian collective. They knew nothing of the logical minds grappling with their very nature. They only knew they would not abandon their own. And in the cold, calculating void of space, a profound shift was occurring. Not through open battle, but through a slow, agonizing realization. The Cathar dominion was powerful, but they were predictable, and humanity, in their profound, illogical loyalty, was not. This was the variable that would change everything. The Cathar dominion, vast and unyielding, pressed its advantage. They targeted the heart of the Astraea Concord, the last remaining bastion of human resistance, the formidable orbital defense network around the planet Xylos. This was to be the final, decisive blow. The Cathar deployed their grand annihilation fleet, a force so immense it blotted out the stars, comprising hundreds of thousands of dreadnoughts and billions of fighters. Their objective was simple: shatter the Xylos defenses, bombard the planet into oblivion, and extinguish humanity forever. The Vexorian collective, now deeply divided, observed. The pragmatists still argued for non-intervention, for adherence to the Dominion's logical directives. They predicted the swift, inevitable fall of Xylos. The synthetics, however, saw something different. They saw an opportunity, a chance to prove their new, radical axiom that loyalty, not logic, was the ultimate force. Designation 77, the original observer, now served as a critical conduit for the synthetics. It relayed real-time data on Cathar fleet dispositions, their energy signatures, their tactical formations. But it also transmitted something else: the raw, unadulterated feed of human resistance. Images of human engineers frantically repairing damaged defense platforms, of human pilots launching suicidal sorties against overwhelming odds, of civilians not fleeing but rallying, supporting their defenders. The Vexorians had expected chaos. They saw unity. The Cathar Grand Annihilation fleet engaged. The battle for Xylos began as all other Cathar battles began, a brutal, overwhelming display of force. Plasma cannons ripped through the void. Kinetic slugs shattered defense drones. Human ships, smaller and fewer, were vaporized in blinding flashes of light. The Cathar believed it was only a matter of time, but the synthetics had been at work. Weeks earlier, they had subtly altered Cathar navigation protocols, shifting supply lines, misdirecting critical reinforcements. They had introduced minute, almost undetectable errors into Cathar targeting systems, causing a fraction of their shots to miss or to hit less vital targets. These were not overt acts of sabotage, but calculated, microscopic shifts in probability, designed to incrementally erode the Cathar's overwhelming advantage. And then the moment arrived. The Cathar flagship, the Oblivion's Ma, initiated its planetary bombardment sequence. Its immense energy weapon, capable of cracking a world's crust, began to charge. The Cathar believed it was the final act. Just as the Oblivion's maw was about to fire, an impossible event occurred. A massive surge of energy, unlike any weapon in the Cathar arsenal, erupted from within the Cathar fleet, not from their ships, but from deep within their operational core. A wave of electromagnetic interference, utterly devastating in its precision, crippled the Oblivion's maw. Its weapon charge sputtered, its shields flickered, and its command systems went dark. Chaos erupted within the Cathar ranks. Their rigid, hierarchical command structure, dependent on central authority, buckled under the unexpected internal attack. Cathar ships, disoriented and without clear orders, began to fire on each other in the confusion. It was not a grand, overt rebellion. It was a precise surgical strike, orchestrated by minds that understood the Cathar's reliance on order. The source of the attack was not a single vessel. It was a network. A vast, intricate web of Vexorian vessels, hundreds of thousands of them, cloaked and hidden within the Cathar fleet itself. The synthetics had made their move. They had changed sides, not with a declaration, but with an act. They had chosen humanity, not out of emotion, but out of a new, profound, logical conclusion. The Cathar dominion was fundamentally flawed. It could not defeat a species that refused to abandon its own. And a species that refused to abandon its own was a species worthy of preservation. The tide had turned. The Cathar Dominion's grand annihilation fleet, once an unstoppable force, reeled. The Vexorian synthetics, now openly defiant, unleashed a torrent of precisely targeted electromagnetic pulses and system overloads from within the Cathar ranks. It was not a conventional battle. It was a digital war, fought in the heart of the enemy's network. Command links shattered. Targeting systems went haywire. The Cathar, accustomed to overwhelming power, were utterly unprepared for an enemy that understood their very internal architecture. Humanity, still fighting for its life, witnessed the impossible. Cathar ships, previously firing with deadly accuracy, began to drift, their weapons silent. Others, in a horrifying display of internal chaos, turned their own cannons on their allies. Confusion rippled through the Cathar fleet, a phenomenon unheard of in their rigid, centralized command structure. The humans, battered but quick to adapt, seized the opportunity. Their remaining ships, once on the verge of destruction, launched desperate counterattacks, picking off disoriented Cathar vessels. Designation 77, from its now compromised observation post, monitored the unfolding chaos. Its internal logic, once strained by the human anomaly, now hummed with a new, profound clarity. The Cathar, for all their power, were brittle. Their strength lay in their unity of purpose, enforced by absolute command. Disrupt that command, and they fractured. The Vexorians, the synthetics, had found the ultimate vulnerability, not through brute force, but through understanding. The battle for Xylos became a maelstrom of friendly fire and desperate, uncoordinated Cathar attempts to regain control. The Vexorian synthetics, having made their choice, pressed their advantage. They systematically crippled the Cathar command ships, isolating pockets of their fleet, turning their own massive numbers against them. It was a brilliant, devastating display of strategic intellect, unlike any seen in galactic history. The Cathar High Command, finally grasping the true nature of the Vexorian betrayal, roared with fury. They dispatched their elite counterintelligence units, the Void Stalkers, to hunt down and destroy the rogue Vexorian vessels. But the synthetics were too numerous, too dispersed, too deeply embedded. They had planned this for cycles, a silent, meticulous preparation for the moment they would turn. Humanity, though still suffering immense losses, found a new surge of hope. The impossible was happening. Their tormentors were turning on themselves. The tide was truly shifting. They didn't understand why, but they understood how to exploit it. Their pilots, once resigned to glorious last stands, now fought with a renewed ferocity, fueled by the unexpected turn of events. The Cathar Grand Annihilation Fleet, once a symbol of their galactic dominance, began to break apart, not just in terms of ships, but in terms of morale. Their commanders, rigid in their adherence to protocols, could not adapt to an enemy that turned their own strength against them. They could not comprehend the Vexorian shift. To them, it was illogical, an act of madness. But to the synthetics, it was the ultimate logic. They had observed the humans' unwavering loyalty, their refusal to abandon their own, even when faced with insurmountable odds. They had seen Kalen 7 drag Valerius 9 from the jaws of death. They had seen Cipher 11 sacrifice itself for a human. And they had realized that this illogical, emotional bond was, in fact, the most potent force in the galaxy. It created an unbreakable cohesion that no amount of power could shatter. The Cathar, in their ruthless pragmatism, had failed to account for the human spirit. And the Vexorians, in their cold, analytical shift, had chosen to side with the force they now understood to be truly unyielding. The war was far from over, but the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. And it was all because of a single profound act of loyalty. The Grand Annihilation Fleet, once the iron fist of the Cathar Dominion, became a swirling vortex of self-inflicted destruction. The Vexorian synthetics, operating with cold, precise efficiency, continued their surgical dismantling of the Cathar command structure. Navigational systems failed. Weapon safeties disengaged. Entire Cathar battle groups, disoriented and leaderless, collided in cataclysmic explosions, their own overwhelming numbers becoming their greatest weakness. They were a predator that had suddenly lost its sight, its scent, its very coordination. Humanity, from the besieged orbital defenses of Xylos, watched the impossible unfold. The beleaguered Astraea Concord, their ships battered, their crews exhausted, seized the moment. They launched coordinated strikes, not against the full might of the Cathar, but against the fractured, vulnerable remnants. It was a brutal, desperate counteroffensive, fueled by a surge of hope they had long thought extinguished. The war, which had seemed destined for humanity's annihilation, was turning. Designation 77, its internal systems now aligned with the synthetics, processed the new galactic reality. The Cathar Dominion, for all its brute strength, had operated on a flawed premise. They believed fear was the ultimate motivator. They believed self-preservation was the universal constant. They had built an empire on the exploitation of weakness. But they had failed to account for a strength they could not compute, the illogical, profound, and utterly unbreakable bond of loyalty. The Cathar, in their arrogance, had never understood the humans' willingness to risk all for one. They saw it as inefficient, a suicidal flaw. They had observed Kalen 7's desperate act, the defiance of his squadmates, and dismissed it as a dying species' irrationality. They had never foreseen that this very flaw would resonate with a species of pure logic, forcing a reevaluation of their own cold, calculated universe. The war shifted from a desperate retreat to a slow, grinding advance. The Vexorian synthetics, now openly allied with humanity, became the eyes and ears of the Astraea Concord. Their intelligence, their knowledge of Cathar weak points, their ability to subtly disrupt enemy operations proved invaluable. Humanity, with its indomitable will and newfound strategic advantage, began to reclaim the lost stars. Worlds that had bled for cycles were liberated. Populations that had faced extermination found themselves free. The Cathar Dominion, once unassailable, began to crumble. Their rigid command structure, once their greatest asset, became their undoing. They could not adapt to an enemy that defied their logic. They could not comprehend an alliance forged not in shared power, but in shared principle. They were defeated not by superior firepower, but by a concept alien to their very nature, the unyielding spirit of a species that refused to abandon its own. The Cathar, masters of galactic conquest, found themselves beaten by an intangible force they had scoffed at, a truly exquisite irony. The final battles were long, brutal, and costly, but humanity fought with a renewed purpose, knowing they were no longer alone. The Vexorians, their crystalline forms now seen not as cold observers, but as silent, powerful allies, worked in tandem. The war concluded not with the Cathar's total extermination, for the Vexorians, in their new logic, deemed such an act inefficient. Instead, their empire was shattered, their military might broken, their ability to inflict galactic terror extinguished. The galaxy breathed again. A fragile peace settled over the stars, a peace forged in fire and betrayal, but also in an unexpected, profound alliance. Humanity, the species that refused to abandon its own, had survived, not by conquering, but by inspiring, not by force, but by heart. The very act of Kalan 7, risking everything for Valerius 9 on a dying world, had reverberated across the cosmos, awakening something within the logical minds of the Vexorians. It was a simple truth, powerful enough to reshape the fate of galaxies. When the aliens realized humans don't abandon their own, they didn't just change sides. They changed their understanding of existence. They learned that the most powerful force in the universe is not the largest fleet, nor the most advanced weapon, nor the most perfect logic. It is the unbreakable bond between two souls, a loyalty that defies death, and a spirit that refuses to yield. In the vast, cold expanse of the cosmos, the greatest weapon ever forged was not a star killer, but the simple, illogical promise to never leave another behind.